He pulled out a checkbook, right there, in my courtroom, in front of everyone. He clicked open a gold pen, looked at me across the bench, and said, "Just tell me the number, Your Honor, and we can all move on." Like justice was a parking meter. Like 38 years of this work, every case, every family, every person who had stood in front of me trying to be honest about the worst moments of their lives. Like all of it had a price tag, and he had already decided he could afford it. I have been on this bench for a long time. I have seen arrogance. I have seen entitlement. I have seen people walk in here absolutely certain that the rules applied to everyone except them. But I had never seen anyone take out a checkbook, not until Marcus Vandenberg. If you believe that the law is not for sale, that no amount of money, influence, or intimidation should be able to purchase a different outcome in an American courtroom, please subscribe before we go further. These stories matter because that belief matters. Now let me take you back to the morning this man walked into my court and made the worst business decision of his life. The case as it came to me on paper involved unpermitted construction. Marcus Vandenberg owned a large estate on Rhode Island's protected coastline. Beautiful land, the kind of land that belongs in some essential way not just to the person who holds the deed, but to everyone, to the community, to the wildlife that nests there, to the children who will one day walk those beaches. Coastal land carries that kind of weight. For 8 months, without permits, without environmental review, without notifying anyone, Vandenberg had been building a major addition to his property, constructed in direct violation of coastal protection laws that exist for specific, documented reasons. Protected sand dunes had been altered. Nesting areas for protected bird species had been disturbed. Water drainage patterns that had developed over generations had been disrupted. When city inspectors arrived to investigate, they found private security blocking their access. When cease and desist orders were filed, Vandenberg's legal team responded with injunctions. For 8 months, he built and fought and kept building. The morning he appeared before me was the first time the situation had reached a courtroom. I had reviewed the file carefully the night before. What I was looking at was not an oversight. It was not a contractor error or a permit that slipped through the cracks. It was a deliberate, sustained decision to ignore the law, supported by lawyers, enforced by private security, and maintained for the better part of a year. I walked out to my bench that morning prepared for a difficult hearing. I was not prepared for Marcus Vandenberg. He was a large man, physically imposing in a way that I imagine he had used to his advantage many times over the years. He wore a well-tailored suit, but what struck me was not the clothes. It was the way he moved, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had never once been required to hurry because someone else was waiting. He looked around my courtroom the way a buyer looks at a property he's considering purchasing, appraising, assessing value. When his eyes reached my bench, he didn't look away. He looked at me with what I can only describe as mild amusement, like I was something he found interesting but not particularly concerning. He sat down, not attentively, not respectfully, but the way you sit when you've already decided you're not going to be here long. I began reading the charges. He interrupted me. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply started talking while I was still speaking, the way people do when they have never learned or never needed to wait their turn. "Your Honor," he said, "I think we can expedite this. I'm prepared to pay whatever fine you have in mind. My time is worth considerably more than these proceedings, and I have actual important business waiting." Actual important business. The gallery stirred. I heard it. I set my papers down carefully. "Mr. Vandenberg," I said, "this is not a transaction. This is a court of law. You are here to answer for violations that have caused ongoing environmental damage to protected coastal land. That is the business before us this morning. Please allow me to finish reading the charges." He leaned back, a small, tolerant smile. And then he reached into his jacket and placed a checkbook on the table in front of him. leather-bound, gold initials on the cover. He clicked open a pen. "What's the number, Your Honor? Tell me the number, and we can all move on with our days." I want to describe the silence that followed. It was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people all understand at the same moment that something has just crossed a line. My clerk looked up from her desk. The bailiff shifted his weight. In the gallery, full that morning, as it often is, I could feel people holding very still. Vandenberg seemed to interpret the silence as consideration, like I was calculating. He was not entirely wrong. I was calculating, just not what he thought. "Mr. Vandenberg," I said, "let me ask you something directly. Are you attempting to offer this court a payment in exchange for a favorable outcome?" He tilted his head slightly, like the question required translation. "Your Honor, I prefer to think of it as recognizing economic realities. This city benefits significantly from my presence. I employ hundreds of people. I generate substantial tax revenue, 17 properties in this area. Surely, when we're talking about some disrupted sand dunes, a practical resolution makes more sense than an extended legal process." He paused, then added, "One businessman to another." I stood up. I do not stand often during proceedings. When I do, everyone in that courtroom understands that something has shifted. Vandenberg looked up at me. For the first time, something flickered across his face that was not confidence, something small and cautious. I walked around from behind my bench. "Mr. Vandenberg," I said, "I want to be very clear about what just happened in this courtroom. You interrupted a sitting judge while charges were being read. You produced a checkbook and asked me to name a price. You then framed that offer as a matter of economic reality and suggested we address it as businessmen." I stopped a few feet from him. "I am not a businessman. I am a judge. My oath is to the law and to the people this court serves. That oath is not for sale. It has never been for sale. It will not be for sale this morning." Vandenberg's jaw tightened slightly. "Your Honor, I meant no disrespect." "You interrupted me again," I said, quietly. "Please don't do that." He closed his mouth. "I want you to understand something about the land you've been building on. Rhode Island's coastal protection laws do not exist to inconvenience wealthy property owners. They exist because the coastline belongs, in a meaningful sense, to everyone. The families who walk those beaches, the communities downstream, the wildlife that has lived there for longer than any of us. When those laws are violated, it is not an abstract offense. It causes real, measurable damage to things that cannot simply be bought back with a check." I looked at him steadily. "The sand dunes you disturbed protect the coastline from storm surge. Their disruption puts neighboring properties at greater flood risk. The nesting areas you destroyed housed a protected bird species that has already declined significantly in this region. The water flow alterations your construction caused will affect drainage patterns in ways that may take years to fully understand." Vandenberg said nothing. "This is not," I said, "a matter of some sand dunes, as you described it. This is 8 months of deliberate, sustained disregard for laws that exist to protect all of us." There was a woman in the third row of the gallery that morning. I had been aware of her since I entered the room. In the peripheral way, you become aware of someone who was paying very careful attention. She was dressed plainly, and she was taking notes. I looked at her now. "I'd like to ask Agent Walsh to please stand and identify herself." Marcus Vandenberg turned around. The woman in the third row rose. She held up credentials. "Special Agent, FBI Environmental Crimes Unit." I watched Vandenberg's face. What I saw there was the specific expression of a man who has just realized that the room he walked into was not the room he thought it was, that the terrain had shifted in ways he had not anticipated, that his private security and his lawyers and his 8 months of successfully keeping inspectors off his property had not, in fact, kept anyone else from watching. Mr. Vandenberg, Agent Walsh said, addressing the court, our unit has been documenting activity at your property and related sites for several months. Based on today's proceedings and the statements made in this courtroom, we will be filing federal charges related to violations of the Clean Water Act, deliberate destruction of protected wetland habitat, and obstruction of regulatory oversight. She paused. We also intend to refer today's statements, specifically the offer made in the presence of this court, to the Department of Justice for review. Vandenberg's attorney was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, my client invokes his Fifth Amendment rights and requests an adjournment. The environmental cease and desist order remains in effect immediately, I said. All construction at the Vandenberg property stops today. Any violation of that order will result in additional criminal charges. I turned back to Vandenberg. He was still standing, but the posture had changed. The ease was gone. What I saw now was a man calculating furiously, running through options, finding fewer of them than he'd walked in expecting. Mr. Vandenberg, I said, you came into this courtroom this morning believing, I think, that there was a number, that everything had a price, including this proceeding and the person conducting it. I paused. I want to make sure you hear what I'm telling you clearly. There is no number, not for this bench, not for the laws protecting that coastline, not for the oath I took or the community I serve. I let that sit. The fine for the violations before this court is the maximum allowable under Rhode Island statute. You have 30 days to pay. Additionally, you were ordered to cease all construction activity immediately and to submit within 60 days a remediation plan developed by certified environmental specialists for restoring the damaged coastal areas. His attorney started to speak. The federal matters, I said, are outside my jurisdiction and will proceed on their own timeline. What I can tell you is that this court's records, including the full transcript of this morning's proceedings, will be made available to every appropriate authority. The gavel came down. Vandenberg stood there for a moment after. The checkbook was still on the table in front of him. He looked at it, then at me, then at Agent Walsh, who was gathering her materials. The bailiff stepped forward. As the room began to move around him, the gallery stirring, his attorney reaching for his arm, I heard Vandenberg say something, not to me, not to anyone specific, just quietly, to himself or to the air. I don't understand, he said, and I believed him, not as an excuse, but as a truth about who he was. He genuinely did not understand. He had built his life inside a version of the world where everything, every obstacle, every consequence, every person standing between him and what he wanted had a price. And that version of the world had been confirmed for him over and over for decades, by lawyers who made problems disappear, by officials who accepted what he offered, by the simple, relentless logic of money meeting resistance and dissolving it. He had walked into my courtroom that morning, operating on decades of evidence that his system worked, and it had worked until it hadn't. The coastline restoration took 18 months. I followed it in the news, the way you follow something you were present at the beginning of. The remediation team, specialists brought in specifically for this kind of damage, worked through 2 winters. They rebuilt dune structures using native plantings. They restored the water flow patterns to as close to their original configuration as the disruption allowed. They documented everything, creating a record that would be used in environmental science programs across New England. About 2 years after that morning in my courtroom, I read a brief item in the local paper. Piping plovers, a protected shorebird, one of the species whose nesting areas had been destroyed, had returned to the restored section of coastline, a small colony, nesting for the first time in 3 years. I set the paper down and sat with that for a while. I thought about what it means for something to be restored, not just fixed, not just compensated for in dollars, actually restored, returned to something closer to what it was meant to be. That is harder than paying a fine. It takes longer, it requires more from more people, and it is not always fully possible. But sometimes it is. Several months after the court proceedings concluded, I received a letter forwarded through my office. It was from a man named Thomas, who identified himself as one of Vandenberg's former employees, a site foreman who had worked on the coastal property. He wanted me to know something. He wrote that he had raised concerns about the permits early on, that he had gone to his supervisor and said, "This construction doesn't have the approvals it needs," that he had been told firmly to continue the work and not to worry about the legal side. He wrote that he had stayed, that he needed the job, that he had a family, and the pay was good, and he told himself the permits would come through eventually. He wrote, "I knew it was wrong. I knew it from the first week, and I kept going anyway because it was easier than stopping. I want you to know that I've thought about that every day since." He wasn't asking for anything. He wasn't making excuses. He just wanted someone to know. I read that letter twice, and I thought about something that Vandenberg had said near the end of that morning, when the weight of the federal charges had finally landed on him, when the confidence had gone, and what was left was something more human. He had said, "I have employees who depend on me. This will destroy innocent people." He meant it as a defense, as a reason to be lenient. But Thomas's letter said something different about it. It said, "The people around you saw what you were doing. Some of them said something. Some of them stayed quiet. All of them will carry the weight of those choices." That is always true when someone in power decides the rules don't apply to them. The consequences don't stop at the person who made the decision. They ripple. I think about Marcus Vandenberg sometimes when a case comes across my desk that involves someone who has confused wealth with exemption. It happens more often than you might think. Not always as dramatically, not always with a checkbook on the table, but the belief is the same. I have contributed enough. I have generated enough. I am worth enough. Surely that counts for something here. And I understand where that belief comes from. I understand that for many people it has been repeatedly confirmed that money does, in many places and many situations, produce different outcomes. That connections and lawyers and resources genuinely change how the system processes people. I understand that. What I want those people to understand is this: the courtroom is meant to be the place where that stops. Not perfectly, not always. Courts are made of human beings, and human beings are imperfect. But the aspiration, the foundational commitment at the heart of what this building is for, is that when you walk through that door, what you have does not determine what you receive. What you did determines what you receive. That is not a small idea. It is, in fact, one of the most radical ideas human civilization has ever produced. That the powerful and the ordinary stand in the same place before the same standard. I have given 38 years of my life to that idea, not because I am naive enough to think it is always achieved, but because I believe that every time it is, every time a person in that gallery watches someone be held to the same standard they would be held to, something is confirmed in them, something they need to believe, something the community needs to believe, that this is real, that it works, that the law at its best belongs to everyone. The piping plovers came back. That is the part of this story I return to most. A species that nests on open, undisturbed coastline, that requires specific conditions to survive, that had been displaced by 8 months of illegal construction and was not guaranteed to return even after restoration was complete. They came back, small birds, easily overlooked, not worth anything in dollars, entirely impossible to replace once gone. They came back because someone did the work of restoring what had been taken from them. I find that to be a meaningful ending, not because of what it says about one man's downfall, but because of what it says about what restoration actually looks like. It is slow. It is uncertain. It requires effort from people who had no part in causing the damage. And sometimes, if the work is done faithfully, if the conditions are restored carefully and honestly, what was lost finds its way home. That is what I hope for, in the courtroom and everywhere else. That what is damaged can, with enough care and enough honesty and enough willingness to do the work, find its way back. If this story stayed with you, share it today with someone who needs to hear that justice is real. Someone who has started to doubt it. Someone who needs a reminder that there are still places in this world where what you have does not determine what you deserve. Because there are. I have been in one of them for 38 years. Order in the court.